I'm Ashley Webster.
I'm Kennedy.
I'm Jason Chaffetz, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, November 5th, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Are Tuesday's election results in part a backlash to years of discussion about race?
Unfortunately, if you prioritize things like our past, you really aren't prioritizing at the same time, our present or our future.
Even some Democrats agree some discussions surrounding race may have gone too far.
It also shows a lack of understanding of what the First Amendment is about. And I think that we have a big problem with that. And there's even a problem with that on the right.
I'm Dave Anthony. This weekend, we fall back. But there is a move in Congress to stop doing that, to save daylight time permanently.
I think people are just kind of tired of needlessly resetting their clocks. It's hard on school kids. It's disruptive to the workforce. It's unnecessary. And I ask the question, why is it preferable to have it get dark at 5 p.m.?
And I'm Joe Mackey. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
One of the big debates in Virginia ahead of Tuesday's election for governor was about education and parental involvement in school, but also CRT, critical race theory, and discussions about how race is being applied to school curriculum, specifically in history classes. The Republican candidate for governor, Glenn Youngkin, seized on this topic.
We will not have political agendas in the classroom, and I will ban critical race theory.
The Democrat in the race, Terry McAuliffe, said,
"We do not teach critical race theory here in Virginia. It has never been taught. It is a racist dog whistle."
Youngkin, the Republican, went on to win. And so did the Republican Lieutenant Governor, Republican Attorney General, and the House of Delegates flipped to Republican in a state that had been trending blue for the past decade. New Jersey's incumbent governor, Democrat Phil Murphy, won, but by a much closer margin than expected. After that, there were mixed headlines and individual reaction about Democrats, that they were in panic mode. Reverend Al Sharpton said, "We've got to really bring everybody together and understand that this is a wake-up call." On the flip side of that, President Obama's former advisor, David Plouffe, said critical race theory is a lie. And I think we have to go on offense. The former Office of Management and Budget Director, Russ Vought, now the founder of the Center for Renewing America, told Fox News anchor John Roberts on Thursday,
"Well, they're at a crossroads. I mean, how can you say that it doesn't exist and then you have others who are saying it's time to double down on it, that the way to deal with this is to go on offense?" And what we saw in Virginia is we saw parents rejecting that across the state and being able to say, we are going to get this out of our schools and you're not going to call us a racist.
Ahead of the election, I talked to Mary Margaret Kesselberg, a Republican who lost her bid for a delegate seat, but said in her conversations with people knocking on doors, she found a deeper issue here.
And it's just the overall environment of people feeling like they can't speak freely without fear of retribution, which is terrible. That's not the country that we are.
That kind of feeling may have been brewing for some time.
People at this point that are being placated, like the outrage mob, they're the same people on social media that they were before they were social media. They're losers.
Jimmy Failla is a comedian and host of Fox News Talks, Fox Across America.
The reason the outrage mob is starting to lose culture wars is we now understand who they are. They're people who want to make everything about them. They're people that ruin otherwise good times because they want to create some type of slight in which they're now owed some type of emotional or tangible reparation. You know a person, like some people do this as a joke, but you've seen people do this seriously, where you say to them, "Oh, like, you look nice today." And they go, "Today? Like I don't look nice other days?"
Yes.
And it's
my gosh.
we do that to each other as a joke once in a while, but we've all met a person who does that, and it's not like shtick. It's like, oh, no, they're actually like, they can't just take the compliment. And you're like, oh, I get it. You're a crazy person. And that's why they're losing their power, I think, is because we realize who they are now.
When I was in Virginia, Jimmy, ahead of the election, I was talking to, a lot of doing the man on the street thing and talking to a lot of people. And one of the big through lines and narratives ahead of that race was about education. And a subset of that was about critical race theory, right? Like, is it being taught? Is it not? What are teachers being trained in? And what are kids learning? And through what lens, right? And some people did express concern, said it's going too far. But others said it is time to be more sensitive, to shift, to be more inclusive, recognize diversity in the classroom. Maybe half your class is of a different ethnicity, and it's time to acknowledge that. When comedians walk into a room and they have an incredibly diverse room on many occasions, what line do you walk? What line do you feel you have to walk, if any?
None. And here's the reason why. When you make fun of somebody in a comedy club, you're treating them as an equal to everyone else in the room. You're not infantilizing them and putting them in the off-limits section. Like, oh, these poor people. Because that's what you're doing. If someone can't be made fun of, you're saying they are a protected class of person. They are not equal to the people you're okay with laughing at. So when I'm in a club, I mean, I'm not that I'm going out of my way. I'm not like a shock jock per se, but I am out there trying to make sure that everybody who goes to a comedy club and pays for 2 watered-down, overpriced drinks gets the same treatment in that room. You know, you don't want an off-limits section, but that is kind of what we are creating. And to something you said earlier, I am offended that you said it's a man on the street. I consider it a they on the street. I don't see gender. It's just, it's a fluid thing. But no, I get it. And, back to the point of what kids really quickly about the classroom. Here's the thing. I have a 12-year-old kid. We're dumping this on them. They don't go out there and predicate people's worth to society based on their racial identity. They predicate it based on who's cool and not cool, who will share their toys, who will give you an extra cookie at lunch. They are not out there living in a world where we're judging people by the color of their skin. Most of us, I think in society, like 99% of us are doing the Martin Luther King thing, judging by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And where I think the issue comes with critical race theory is they're presenting this as if we don't want to teach America's real history, when in truth, nobody in the history of this country has taken a social studies class that didn't say we had institutional slavery. Okay, the problem with critical race theory is not that it's teaching our history, it's that it continues to claim that it's our present. It's saying we've never made the progress that we made. And I think a lot of people are so insulted by that claim because it really denigrates the contributions of all the people who fought and died in protest and got beat up and went to jail for civil rights. It's like nobody is saying we're a perfect country, but we're not going to get there if we can't acknowledge how much progress we've made to get here.
Finally, Jimmy, I was reading on Twitter. I even heard some talk show hosts while I was in Virginia. And, there have even been some op-eds after Tuesday with what happened in Virginia and how close it was in New Jersey, that really the Republican sort of victory in Virginia and the closeness in Jersey was in part a rejection of some of this stuff that we've been talking about, some of this, that people don't want to have these cultural issues and feel like they're being labeled a certain way. And we've already talked about race and how it's, being taught. How big a role do you think that cultural discussion played in Tuesday's elections?
I think if you look at the exit polls, it was a big role. And that's my gut, too, and just being on talk radio every day. It's not that people are against teaching us about race. It's not that people are against teaching our history. It's that doing so doesn't offer a deliverable to people that are struggling right now. Like if you can't pay your bills or you can't afford a tank of gas, ripping down a Thomas Jefferson statue doesn't help. I'm not saying you're not entitled to that view, whether you want to rip a statue down, put a plaque up. I'm not saying you're not entitled to teach America's history. But the problems facing people right now are substantive primal problems. And they're not problems, that come from the superficial space of how we discuss issues. It's from the space of the house is on fire. Can we get a hose and some water? And unfortunately, if you prioritize things like our past, you really aren't prioritizing at the same time our present or our future. And that's where I think people in Virginia rejected this on such a large scale and made education probably the central issue, is because they realize, yes, it's important, but it's not important to resegregate society through racial identity. And that's what a lot of people felt was going on. And lastly, I don't know who the political strategist was who told Terry McAuliffe he should tell parents to shut up. But in my experience, telling suburban women to shut up doesn't generally end as good as you might think it would.
Now, depending on which Democrats you talk to after Virginia's election, they are experiencing mixed feelings about this discussion. Jessica Tarlov, a Fox News contributor and Democratic strategist, thinks it's not as dominant as some think, though still something the party has to grapple with.
Well, it was certainly a through line in Virginia. In New Jersey, I don't think it was a factor whatsoever. I don't think that CRT, critical race theory, came up whatsoever in debates or in any conversation that Phil Murphy had. Definitely more of an issue in Virginia, but it was really interesting. If you look at the op-ed that Glenn Youngkin, the governor-elect wrote for us on foxnews.com, he didn't mention critical race theory in it. He talked about education in general. And he talked about parents having good services, right? That public schools should work for them, and problems with the teachers' unions. And I think that that was more of the pervasive problem than the culture war issues. And that's how you got so many people who had supported Democrats in past elections, whether voting for President Biden or voting for Ralph Northam, for instance, to switch over and to support Glenn Youngkin. So I saw it more as education than the culture war side of education. But no doubt it was a factor for some. And when you look at how many Trump voters Youngkin was able to turn out in rural areas, he actually did better than the former president did. You know that the culture war stuff was resonating there.
A great video was sent to me of comedians talking about how they feel like they can't go on college campuses specifically anymore, that everyone's just offended, and it's antithetical to comedy. And I think it was John Cleese who had some really insightful commentary a few years ago about how when you're surrounded by people who are like just so super sensitive, you can't be free. And that political correctness has turned into like any joking criticism of any group ends up being labeled cruel. Where does the Democratic Party go with this? Where does the progressive wing of the Democratic Party go with this? Especially when you hear comedians talking about college campuses. It's younger folks in particular, right? I mean, they're going to grow up and all the older folks aren't going to be here anymore. So they're the ones who are going to be in power, these people on university campuses who, are particularly sensitive.
The backlash on campuses against thought from the other side has been a big problem. I'm someone who was in academia for a long time through my PhD level. I certainly know what these campuses are like. And I think that it was something positive about Joe Biden that people felt like he got it, that he was a normal person, right, who made mistakes and had friends of other political persuasions. And it was like a return to normalcy that way. And I think with the way that the Democratic Party is structured right now, we don't have progressives in huge positions of power, like Nancy Pelosi, Whip Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, et cetera. Those are all, tried and true moderates. But it will be something that needs to be addressed. And an art form like comedy does need to be stood up for. I'm not necessarily taking sides on the Dave Chappelle versus transgender Netflix employees debate, even though I'm a huge Dave Chappelle fan, and I'm glad that he said that he would meet with whoever, but also I'm not taking my jokes down. It's a bummer because, first of all, you miss out on a lot of great fun in not partaking in the comedy that these people are producing. But it also shows a lack of understanding of what the First Amendment is about. And I think that we have a big problem with that. And there's even a problem with that on the right. If you look at Josh Hawley, who was going to sue Simon & Schuster, I think was his publisher, right? They said that they didn't want to publish his book anymore after he participated in the January 6th demonstrations. And, he said, like, this is Orwellian. It's not Orwellian, right? It's free press, right? It's free market capitalism. They made a decision as a private company that they didn't want to publish his book. He then went and got picked up somewhere else. So this isn't something that only the left does. It's something that the right runs with as well. And they don't want to own up to that, which I think is extremely detrimental to the conversation. But I guess if I could get away with it, I probably would continue to try to as well.
Jessica Tarlov, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Joe Mackey with your Fox News commentary coming up.
We fall back this weekend, reverting to standard time, giving most of us an extra hour of sleep. Though when we wake up Sunday, we will have to change the clocks. In a digital world, not really a big deal anymore, but some people have had enough.
I don't like the changing time at all because it kind of messes me up. Messes everybody's up.
Many want to stop falling back, to just spring forward and leave the clock that way.
I guess we get the extra hour of daylight, so I'll take it.
Many lawmakers agree. Nearly 20 states have passed laws or resolutions for permanent daylight saving time. But Congress won't allow that. It only lets states opt for permanent standard time, which Arizona and Hawaii have. They don't change the clocks there. Congressman Chris Stewart is trying to change all this with a proposed Federal Daylight Savings Act.
It's not a partisan issue. There's bipartisan support for this effort. It's not a red state, blue state issue.
Congressman Stewart is a Republican from Utah.
My gosh, California supports it, Florida, Alabama, Washington. I mean, it's a mix of interest here, again, because it affects every American. And I think people are just kind of tired of needlessly resetting their clocks. It's hard on school kids. It's disruptive to the workforce. It's unnecessary. And I ask the question, why is it preferable to have it get dark at 5 p.m.? When I was in the Air Force, we were stationed at a northern tier base, and our kids were walking home from school in the dark. And I just think there's a lot of people who feel like, hey, let's just leave it on daylight savings time. Let's not have the change. Let's have that extra hour in the evening rather than in the early morning. And we hope we're going to be able to get this done.
Okay, so let's go through where we are now. At the moment, this is something that states decide. In the current system, a state can choose whether to have daylight saving time or not have any at all. Like Arizona and Hawaii, they never change the clocks, but they're on standard time all the time. If a state wants to change to standard time, it can. If it wants to change permanently to daylight saving time, what happens?
It cannot right now. As you said, states are currently unable to opt out of the standard time, and we want to give them that option of staying on the daylight savings time, which is, it's confusing for some people. They may not know because we only consider, once or twice a year, but daylight savings time is the time we're on now. And right now, states have to switch back to standard time, and we just want to give them the option. And look, we recognize it would be disruptive if one or two states did it, but we don't think only one or two states will. Again, we've got 19 or 20 states who have indicated already that they would follow this, and we have many more that indicate, hey, if that's allowed us as a possibility, we certainly would. And they would do it in regions as well. And I think that's kind of the key to this, is there's got to be some consistencies, but we think there's enough states who have indicated that this would be their interest to do that we would have that. I do think the last point is that it should be up to states. I don't know that the federal government should mandate the time for states. And again, recognizing regional interests, but also recognizing that many states have already indicated that they would do it on a regional basis. We really do think it's kind of a win-win.
Okay. So what would you have Congress do? What rules would you want in place? If this was something you could get passed, what would you do?
We would just allow states to choose to stay on daylight savings time rather than be compelled to go to standard time.
Uh-huh.
And it's really that simple.
Now, you mentioned region. Would you have to do it with other states in your area, or could you do it by yourself as a state?
Well, you technically could do it by yourself, but as we've already indicated, we know that there's a majority of states who would like to do it, and that we would anticipate they would do it by region.
Okay.
So I think you may have a couple one-offs. For example, Arizona is slightly different than the other states around them right now, so we wouldn't compel them. But I think there's clear advantage in this. As I said, we've got 19 states already who have passed legislation to do it. We've got many more who have said, if given the opportunity, we would do it. So we don't think that the one-offs is going to be a problem. We think we're going to have the vast majority of states, and probably all the states, who would choose to do this.
Would it be confusing, though, if, let's say, 33 states decided to do it, the other 17 decided not to make it permanent, and then some either stayed standard like Arizona and Hawaii, or others do the time switch? I mean, would it be hard to know what state, if you're doing business, what state did it and what state didn't and what time it is, or is it that really not that big an issue?
Well, I mean, that would be the worst case outcome. But again, we don't think that will happen, but we don't think it's going to be the problem that some people propose it might be.
Okay. Now, you mentioned this is bipartisan. People on the right and left like this. People in different states, red states and blue states like this. So why can't it get done? How many lawmakers have you spoken to that oppose allowing states to make a decision like this?
Well, so far the answer to that question is none. And I mean that literally. I mean, there's no one that we've reached out to who hasn't said, yeah, we would support that. Now, there's been a few who have said, hey, let me talk to my state legislatures. Let me talk to my state leaders, make sure that this would reflect what they would want to do. So there have been a few who have said, let me get back to you. But no one has said, no, I don't think we want to do that. And, it's interesting, too, the diverse backgrounds of people who support this. I come from a farming background. So every fall, my brothers call me who are still running the family farm, and they say, hey, when are you going to change this law so we don't have to switch our times again? I've talked to nurses. I've talked to school teachers. I've talked to young families. I mean, very, very diverse backgrounds. And I think that's reflected in our response in Congress. When we talk to other congressional members, I think they reflect those varied interests. And that's why it's been able to be bipartisan and again, not a red state, blue state thing across the country.
So if that's the case and you have all this support, how do you get it passed? How do you get the bill on the floor of Congress, get it in the Senate? I mean, what's taking so long? What's the obstacle?
Oh, my gosh. If you are an impatient person, please don't run for Congress because you're going to drive yourself nuts. It just takes time. And part of it is just getting people's attention, which is what we're doing now. We're building our co-sponsors. And, I think we're going to have a couple hundred co-sponsors on this. And after that, you have to get floor time. And as you know, the Congress has been very, very busy doing some bills that, frankly, I think make no sense at all. But that's what Ms. Pelosi has chosen to do. So it's really just kind of a matter of working through the process. But if I could give you an analogy that maybe casts some light on this, I've sponsored a bill to create a national suicide prevention hotline number, 988. Bipartisan, it's going to literally save thousands of lives. It doesn't cost any money. And oh my gosh, who doesn't want to help someone who's in the middle of a mental health crisis,
right? Or
someone who suicide prevention? That bill, as easy as it was and as important it was, still took 3 years. And I use that as an example. Even the easy things take time in Congress. So we're not surprised that this one's the same, but we're going to keep at it. And we think that we've got a momentum to where we're going to be able to get it done, and hopefully get it done in the next year or so.
Okay. Let me give you the opposition side to having full-time daylight saving time. And that generally goes into, if you go and you are on saving time permanently, as we get into November, here we are, and then December, a month from now, I'll use Logan, Utah. You were born there, correct, Congressman?
Yep, that's right.
Logan, Utah has a sunrise on December 20, which is right around the longest day of the year, of 7:51 a.m. in standard time. If it was permanently daylight saving time, the sun would rise at 8:51 in the morning. And the argument is that all the kids who go to school in Logan, Utah, will be waiting for the bus in the dark. And that's one of the concerns, that people will be driving to work in the dark and all the commute in the dark. So that's the concern about having permanent daylight saving time. What's your response?
Well, a couple of things. One is I wish that we could pass legislation that would give us 14 hours of sunlight every day. That would be ideal, but not able to do that one. And so then you have the trade-offs. And I think the question is, would you rather have that hour of sunlight in the afternoon or in the early morning? And I really think that most people would prefer it in the afternoon. And so you use your example, well, kids are waiting at the school bus in the dark or the semi-dark.
Right.
But as I've already indicated, having been stationed up north and other things, our kids were walking home in the dark. So it's not, you don't eliminate that problem. It's either in the beginning of the day or at the end of the day.
Well, most kids don't go home from school at 4:45 unless they have an after-school activity. Schools do get out in most places between 2 and 4 o'clock. When even in standard times, worst, horrible darkness times in the afternoon, it's still light.
Well, I think that kind of depends. Number one is a lot of kids are involved with school activities, and the school day kind of fluctuates depending on where you are, of course, in your local school district.
Sure.
But it wasn't uncommon at all, and I think you could also counter argue. Well, a lot of schools don't start at 8 or 7:50. A lot of schools start at 8:30 or 8:45. But you're right. This doesn't solve that problem. It just makes it so we transfer that to the afternoon. But again, a lot of people, I think, feel, as we've talked to people, a lot of people think that, hey, that's my preference. The other thing is it eliminates this changing of time. So it allows people to kind of get on one time, stay on that time, you adjust to the daylight, whether it's in the morning or later on in the afternoon. It allows you for the consistency. And that's one of the benefits of the bill, I think. 100 years ago, when we really were a rural an agricultural centered economy and centered people, which was, I think, one of the main points. People were used to getting up with the sun. They were used to going out and milking the cows and, taking care of the garden and that kind of thing earlier. And then, being tired and kind of relaxing or drying things down in the evening. But our culture just isn't like that any longer. I mean, so much of our activity, so much of things we do now are after school events, or, we don't go home from work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, my personal preference would be to give me that sunlight in the afternoon, not in the early morning.
Okay. So you think that maybe by, let's all right, you said I should be patient. Let's say it's 1 year from now, 2022, and we're getting ready to fall back again. Do you think Congress by then will have passed this law?
I think it's 50-50 or maybe a little more. And it's hard for me to predict because, as I said, I'm a Republican. I'm not in the majority, so we don't get control of the House floor. But I think that we're going to get enough Democratic support for this that we can get some of their attention. So, again, I hate to do predictions, especially in politics. Oh, my gosh, you can imagine that. But, I'm hopeful, and I'm realistically hopeful that we can.
Republican Congressman Chris Stewart from Utah, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's been fun. Thank you so much.
Hey, it's Brett Larson, inviting you to download and listen to the new daily Fox on Tech podcast. There's part of a colorful late 90s iMac on Mars. It's an idea that seems a lot like Kickstarter, called Build It. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tonya J. Powers.
Nothing brings on the nostalgia like seeing a toy you had when you were a child. They can be good memories, like getting your first Barbie or your favorite Hot Wheels car. Or they can be memories that spark other feelings, like the Easy Bake Oven you never got. Either way, toys hold a special place in our hearts, and this year's class of playthings inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame may have a few memories bubbling up for you. The newest inductees are American Girl dolls, the strategy board game Risk, and Sand. They were chosen from 12 finalists, which included 4 other games like Battleship and Billiards, as well as Cabbage Patch Kids, Masters of the Universe, Fisher-Price Corn Popper, the Toy Fire Engine, and the Piñata. The Toy Hall of Fame is in the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. Anyone can nominate a toy, but to be considered, they must have withstood the test of time and memory, changed play or toy design, and fostered learning, creativity, or discovery. Hence the induction of Sand this year, which the group called perhaps the most universal and oldest toy in the world. This year's inductees joined 74 previous honorees, including the Big Wheel, the Game of Life, G.I. Joe, Crayola crayons, and the Easy Bake Oven. Always wanted one of those with the little light inside, the little. I'm over it. I'm really past it, y'all. Tonya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Mackey.
What's on your mind?
A lot of people wonder what it's like being a stand-up comedian during a pandemic. Well, the rooms are half full, the club owners look disappointed, and people call me a murderer. So not much has changed, except that when they say murderer now, it's not a euphemism for having a great set. They actually think I'm a murderer. That brings up a challenge that's been increasing long before the coronavirus was probably created in a lab. There's a massive shortage in critical thinking. Am I really a murderer for performing stand-up comedy? Each club I worked at has been abiding by local COVID rules. Basically, a comedy club's like a restaurant. So I went into a restaurant and I talked. If I'm a murderer, it's because of something else and you can't prove anything. There's a critical shortage of critical thinking. I've heard people inside restaurants without masks eating complain when people walk in without a mask. So people not wearing masks are complaining about others not wearing masks. The explanation is they're allowed to remove their mask while they're eating, as if COVID cares. They just aren't thinking. They're just following the rules from the experts that have a worse track record than a derailed train. I better be careful. Talking about unimproved realities can get you censored. I should just go along with the mainstream. Speaking of which, have you heard my new joke about how women like shopping? I'm Joe Mackey. Head to joemackey.com, MACHI, to find out where you can catch my stand-up.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network, subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.